So I just wanted to echo that. Thank you to Ricky, Fan, and David for having me. That's really nice of you. Um, so I wanted to take this opportunity this afternoon to present some thinking from the very early stages of what you might call a new project or a potential new project. The project proposes to think about the historicity of HIV/AIDS in an Anglo-American context through the lens of stillness, and in particular the film still as a cinematic device or even medium in and of itself that foregrounds a consideration of interruption, duration, and fragmentation within broader conversations about the relationship of moving image and temporality. So the term still is commonly understood as not moving or making a sound. But in the adverbial form, in the stillness of a phrase like "I still love you," the term implies not the absence of something, but something's endurance through time. So, and I think of the adverbial stillness, the adverbial kind of idea of stillness as mirroring, and this hopefully will become a little bit more apparent when I begin speaking about the film, something to do with desire, a kind of Lacanian form of desire, in the way it's a form of continuity that is also a kind of remainder. So the adverbial still-ness of a phrase like "I still love you" bespeaks all those reasons why love might not endure. These many years, that one time, my love for someone or something else. It is possible then, I think, to think of the film still not simply as a moment frozen and clipped from the continuity of cinematic time, but also as something that frames forms of duration that are rooted in forms of disruption. In his writing on the cinematic photograms that make up the celluloid strip, Garrett Stewart calls the film still a marginal but potent figure in the history of film. A number of scholars have argued that the central but paradoxical role of stillness in moving image is generative in understanding film's historical and political significance from the vantage point of the 21st century, because it draws into question the idea of time as a unified chronological unfolding towards a universal now. I'm just going to grab this because So, one of these scholars, Laura Mulvey, insists in Death 24 Times a Second that, quote, that there is, quote, a political dimension to the role of stillness in moving image, one that is potentially able to challenge patterns of time that are neatly ordered around the end of an era, its before and its after. The still then might serve as one way to answer the call made by a number of scholars in recent years to reconsider the historical periodization of HIV/AIDS in terms of a kind of strict beginning and end. And actually, Ricky's introduction or editorial of the issue he recently did for Drain magazine on AIDS and memory kind of fits into this, a kind of consideration and problematization of a kind of neat ordering of past, present, and conclusion, I guess. And then parallel to this criticism are those who have kind of pointed out the problems with linking the progressive narrative, the progressive medical narrative of the eradication to HIV/AIDS, and how it fits in with what Douglas Crimm calls the moralistic narrative of gay men's coming into a kind of political maturity or citizenry. So the film I want to discuss briefly today, Ira Sachs's 2012 film, Keep the Lights On, is one we might situate under the umbrella of post-AIDS cinema. A number of critics have warned of the impulse and desire to name the post-AIDS era, examining how proclamations about the end of AIDS serves to displace the ongoing political, medical, and cultural significance of HIV from the present moment. My understanding of the post-AIDS cinema, however, is not so much a matter of delineating the clear-cut boundary of AIDS' influence as a historical epoch, but rather of signifying conditions and qualities of AIDS that are present, but not in ways that have the weight or substance of being what the story is about. The films I count as post-AIDS then aren't films where AIDS no longer matters, but where AIDS matters in ways that don't quite amount to the actions and events that move the movie along. I'm interested in the way the synoptic insignificance of AIDS in the plot of a given movie opens onto forms of lingering or stillness, that adverbial stillness that complicates how we organize the past, present, and future of the disease. The post, we might even say, in post-AIDS cinema, suggests the adverbial stillness of AIDS when AIDS ceases to move us, or at least ceases to move us in the ways we're familiar with. Crisis, I guess. So, to say a little bit about the film, Keep the Lights On is about the 10-year-long romantic, sexual, and domestic relationship between two men in New York City. They meet on a phone sex hotline. It isn't a relationship that's expected to last. Paul has a girlfriend. The next time they meet, Paul pulls him back into bed as Eric dresses to leave. Paul, a successful lawyer, uses crack. He disappears for days on end. Years pass. Eric orchestrates an intervention, is there when Paul returns from rehab, holds his hand while a prostitute fucks him in an expensive hotel suite after he relapses. When Eric and Paul next meet, years later, we learn that Paul's been away again, longer this time, more rehab. They fall back into their old relationship, but Eric is sober, and his sobriety means a strange kind of distance between the men. Perhaps it's that Eric can't stand the constant fear that one day Paul will once again disappear. Paul wants to move in with Eric, to kind of move the relationship along, as it were, but Eric isn't sure. Paul gives him an ultimatum, saying to Eric, I'm not doing this to be difficult or to try to control things. I'm doing this because I have to do this to save my life. Paul says yes, agrees to move in with Eric, to start fresh. But that same day, he drives all night from a weekend house in the country to catch Paul at his dingy one-room Manhattan apartment before he leaves for work. It's Paul who says what Eric can't, that Eric can't do it, so it's over. Keep the Lights On is a film about the longue durée of an intense but ultimately doomed relationship of two men. However, although the film effectively begins with Eric and Paul's first encounter and ends with their last goodbye, it is also a film notably suspicious of the telling of a relationship as a series of sequential events, leading purposefully from beginning to end on a given timeline. It's a film about false starts and incomplete endings. In an interview, Seitz describes the structure of the film as being all about middles. Quote, "It's not about the beginning and end," he says, "it's a series of middles." So, I guess in a way that brings me around, in a roundabout way, to the image on the screen. This image, the photograph of this woman, appears 3 times throughout the film. And just sort of like visually, it's an example of kind of mise en abîme, of which there are many, I guess, in the film. The film is, I haven't mentioned, a film about, Eric is a filmmaker, so the film is a film about a filmmaker who happens to be making a film about a gay filmmaker. And in the clip I'm going to show, we'll see a little bit more of that kind of played out. But Eric and Paul first encounter this image as part of a series of photographs at a gallery exhibition they visit early on in their relationship. The scene comes immediately after one in which Eric and Paul smoke crack together for the first time. The images are granular, muted, very tight close-ups of people's faces. Their expressions are pained but ambiguous. I don't feel like all expressions are pained are ambiguous, but I added that anyways. So, you know. Anyway. So we're told in the context of the film that the images are of people missing the subway train in New York City. And if you do a little bit of research, you can find out that the images are, in fact, from a real-life video artist named Neil Goldberg. And in particular, they come from actually a video piece comprising of a series of 3-second clips of people missing the train. Goldberg speaks about the work in terms of the mingling of sort of the tragic and mundane parceled into a kind of fleeting moment. And so that tension between the kind of trivial and tragic is kind of what interests him. So we see the image again when Paul returns from rehab for the first time. And we're going to see that. Paul gives Eric the photograph as a gift, a kind of thank you, during this kind of moment of happiness, but also a moment tinged with suspicion that maybe Eric's happiness of Paul being back is premature. And then we see it again for a third time, this image, photograph, freeze frame, when Eric returns from a trip of his own to learn for certain that Paul has once again disappeared. So I think that's all I need to do really to set up the clip, and so I'll play it. It's a 4-minute clip, and then I'll return to my presentation, obviously. Sound. Yeah, sound. Okay, perfect. Thanks.
It's amazing.
Meine Damen und Herren, bitte lassen Sie mich nach der Bühne willkommen auf die Bühne für den besten kurzen Dokumentarfilm, Greta Schaller.
I'll pick up the phone. We just won a Teddy Award, Best Documentary. Well, are you there? Okay, call me back as soon as you get this. I love you. Back as soon as you get this.
Okay, bye.
I love you.
Taking that away from you guys. So you get that kind of like echo where, you know, Eric returns to his own voice, kind of echoed on the answering machine, a message that Paul never received. Where's my sheet? God. Okay, so before just maybe speculating on a few of the potential significances of this reoccurring still image in the broader narrative of the film, I thought I would just sort of bring in the voices of a few of the kind of key references, at least as I see it, in scholarly discussions about the spaces between still and moving image. When Roland Barthes writes about cinema, he notoriously resists its movements. As in Laura Mulvey's words, for Barthes, cinema's relentless movement, reinforced by the masquerade and emotion of fiction, could not offer the psychic engagement and emotion he derived from the still photograph. But whereas Barthes seems to perpetually bring the moving image, when he looks at it, back to stillness, Gilles Deleuze, by contrast, seems to deny stillness a place in film altogether. And this leads to some frustration from some. Raymond, in the sense that it kind of potentially disallows for an understanding of stillness as a form of disruption or rupture. Raymond Ballure writes, "There is one category of time not considered by Gilles Deleuze in his dynamic taxonomy of images, the interruption of movement, the often unique, fugitive, yet perhaps decisive instant where cinema seems to be fighting against its very principle. In Cinema 1, Deleuze dismisses the conception of cinema as a succession of still images bearing the illusion of motion, instead insisting that it is the continuity of movement itself that constitutes the medium of film. In short," Deleuze writes, "cinema does not give us an image to which movement is added. It immediately gives us the movement image," or we can maybe translate that as the image of movement itself. Deleuze doesn't approach stillness in film as a contradiction of cinematic form. Instead, for him, stillness exemplifies the filmic as the movement of time itself. Writing, just to elaborate on that a little bit, writing in particular about the long still frames of Yasujiro Ozu's films, Deleuze writes, "At the point where the cinematographic image most directly confronts the photograph, it also becomes most radically distant from it." So I guess I wanted to kind of come back to this point, this idea of the adverbial form of stillness. And I guess I kind of have an interest in kind of thinking about the way it might help me sort of navigate these two poles of thinking about stillness as a kind of disruption, or in fact as a kind of underscoring of what is essential about cinematic time. So the temporality of still in its adverbial sense might suggest a means of mediating between the idea of stillness as something that on the one hand exemplifies cinematic time, its complexity and purity, and on the other hand the idea of stillness as a disruptive force that pushes against the basis of how we understand the filmic. So concluding now, really, just with a few kind of speculative points, maybe you might have some to add to this list, about the kind of potential significance of the still images in Keep the Lights On, or this one particular image. I think it kind of speaks to, at least in one sense, it symbolizes the permeability of the film's diegetic structure or flow. And I think that this lends significance to how we think about the films in terms of the kind of determining absence of HIV/AIDS in the film. So there is mention of AIDS in the film, but these references are kind of, they kind of come out of nowhere, and they kind of mark the film as not being about AIDS in a sense. We hear about Eric's an earlier boyfriend. Friends of Eric's kind of talk about him in passing, and we know that he has AIDS, or has HIV, is HIV positive, rather. And we hear that he's there's kind of a mention that he's like going to the gym and looking really cute, and then he moved to South America, and Eric notes that, oh wow, Paolo, his name, always wanted to do that. So not only does Sachs kind of remove, literally omit the figure of HIV from the film in that way, he also kind of obviously pushes back against the kind of trope of the AIDS figure geared towards the kind of catharsis of his death that we get in properly AIDS films like Parting Glances, like this earlier generation of films, Parting Glances, It's My Party, Philadelphia as well. And then the other kind of point, oops, that's my guess I'm almost out of time, so I'll wrap up. But what's kind of interesting maybe about the kind of patterning of this film is that, in a sense, the kind of dynamics of Paul's drug use kind of, in a sense, takes the place of AIDS in the film, mirroring the ethic of care, the temporalities of tragedy, holding on, loss, letting go, and moving on that we see in, like I said, this earlier generation of properly AIDS films. And then just the last point, just to kind of complicate the idea that somehow the still images is a kind of contradiction of the diegetic structure of the film. There's also, a way in which we could read the still image as actually structuring that narrative, insofar as the film is about, so structured it in the sense that, moving kind of quickly along here, but it's possible to read the scene. I mentioned how Sachs described his film as being structured as a series of middles. Days, sometimes months pass. Days, sometimes years or weeks pass between scenes unannounced. We don't always know how to fill in the intervening spaces between cuts. Indeed, we might even describe the film scenes as being themselves like film stills, in that they seem to be dislocated fragments of some holistic original, and yet in this fragmentary state are paradoxically all the more illustrative of the lives they represent. So to echo Roland Barthes again here, he writes of the film still, to a certain extent, the filmic very paradoxically cannot be grasped in the film still, in situation and movement, in its natural state, but only in that major artifact, the still. So the dislocated and static feeling of many of Sachs' scenes seem to echo the strange metonymic paradox that Barthes describes existing between the film and the film still, albeit on a different scale. In other words, it is precisely the fragmentary, dislocated quality of the individual scenes that offers a kind of satisfaction at odds with the idea that lives themselves exist in situation, in movement, in their natural state. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.